All right, welcome back everybody to Campus Conversations. John and I took a little break the last 2 weeks. We've had some, a lot of things going on, just a variety of things going on. So we tabled for 2 weeks so we could get our special guest. When John and I planned the calendar for the semester, April is Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and we felt that it was important to get our friend and former colleague to join us for this conversation about why Domestic Violence Awareness Month is important and how that plays into intersectionality and just the landscape of domestic violence and who it impacts, and to debunk any misconceptions or any of those things. And of course, John and I have the most amount of confidence in Stephanie, and we thought that bringing her in for this and to have a great conversation today was what we needed to do. So welcome, Stephanie, to Campus Conversations.
I'm thrilled to be here, and I've missed the Monmouth College community. I missed both of you, and I'm really looking forward to this conversation as much as one can when it's this kind of a topic.
Absolutely. Well, John and I have, over the course of the semester, have hit on some heavy topics as part of the diversity, equity, and inclusion working groups, overarching goals and things that we wanted to see accomplished for the school year and moving forward on campus is how do we navigate through hard conversations? And, often, as we were kind of talking about behind the scenes before we went live, often John and I tend to be the ones in situations that have to help students muster through that. Whether, unfortunately, if we had to play good cop, bad cop, no pun intended, John usually gets the bum rap because he is our judiciary guy on campus and is responsible for those things. In my role as Director of Multicultural Student Services, navigating hard conversations always tends to land in my lap. And we always hope that they don't have to intersect in a negative light. We want them to intersect in a positive light. But if we don't help students, and the DEI committee felt that it was very imperative that we have to do better. And doing better means that we set the example on navigating through the yucky stuff to get to the good stuff. Mutual respect is important. We don't have to agree the same. We don't have to all believe in the same things. We don't even have to come from the same places. But understanding and meeting someone where they're at is important. And the topic of domestic violence is absolutely one that need to be brought to light. John, did I miss anything?
No, you're right on. That's exactly what we wanted to talk about.
Oh, I'm giving a shout out to Emily Renwick. She texted me too and reminded me don't forget to hit record. Love that lady.
You talk about difficult discussions, and I think that there couldn't be a topic that's more difficult to discuss than sexual assault and domestic violence. I mean, I think we can all agree to that. And I think as professionals in the field and as someone who does Title IX work and just equal opportunity, I think it helps when we ourselves can be compassionate and even a little bit vulnerable. Don't you all think as well? Mm-hmm. I know and this is something I did not ever do until probably the last few years. And actually, Regina, you helped me overcome this a bit. And that's to actually admit some of my own personal experiences. Now, this is not something that when I'm talking to a student about a sexual assault, I don't bring up my own experiences. That's not appropriate. But at the same time, as students know that, listen, as a victim of domestic violence as a child, I get it. I get what happens. I get the long-term effects. I understand why it's difficult to talk about this, but I think it gets rid of some of the shame that often women carry to be as victims of, and I shouldn't say just women, all genders carry that kind of shame when it comes to violence and abuse.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. I know that, John, we've talked about this, when you had Tim come, was it my first year on campus, 2016 or 2017? Just that reminder that women are not only, it's not just women that are victims. And what does that look like? And how is a man a victim? And, I've said to my husband several times, in the kind of the day and era that we live, I worry about my sons just as much as I worry about my daughter.
Of course. And, I jotted down some numbers because I think it's important to just kind of understand where we are in the landscape, even in the US. First of all, I want to mention that 42.5 million women in the US have experienced domestic violence or a sexual assault from a partner in their lifetime. Now, I want you to think about 42.5 million. I mean, that's a huge number. But when you want to break it down, and I think it's important to understand that because when we talked about intersectionality, because that does affect who the victims of abuse and sexual assault are. But we know that 82% of all juvenile victims of rape and sexual assault are female. 90% of adult victims are female. But that doesn't mean that men aren't affected, or all genders, because to be honest, the LGBTQ population experiences sexual assault and domestic violence at an even higher rate than any other population. So I think it's important to note that we're not giving resources where they need to be given. I think back to my own experience. Now, I was a child in the 70s, and if you look back at kind of the history of awareness of sexual assault and even domestic violence, it wasn't until the 70s that we really started talking about things. And up until that point, I believe there were a lot of people that said, oh, that was just strict parenting, or those parents they argued a lot. But the very first rape crisis center was created in 1971. And when you think about that, in my lifetime was the first rape crisis center. That's not very long ago. The very first Take Back the Night event was in 1978. And it was held to be able to just show that women shouldn't have to be afraid to walk to their car. You all know the saying that men are afraid women will make fun of them. Women are afraid men will rape and kill them. So there is a huge difference about the kinds of fears that women walk around with. And I mean, what are some of the things you hear from students?
Go ahead, John. I'll let you.
No, I mean, my perspective obviously is I often will hear more from a male perspective because that's who opens up more to me rather than women, to be honest. But yeah, I'm hearing that what you were talking about, Stephanie. It's definitely resonates with me because that's been an often, talked about thing of, well, I don't want some girl to be, saying that, I'm a bad guy because, I'm just making a joke. And you're like, well, hang on, let's talk about what that joke was. Let's talk about the environment that was created from that comment or whatnot. And it goes back to the ramifications, right? Because as a man, what's the worst? Some girl will say that I'm a jerk, that I am, you can say sexual predator if I make a joke in poor taste. But if it goes the other way, I am sexually assaulting a woman. That's the opposite end of it. And so I think a lot of it goes to education and understanding that it has to be, when I say education, I mean actively fighting against that mentality of boys will be boys. Hey, women just can't take a compliment anymore. I was just saying her legs look good. No, that never was okay to say. And so now that you're being called to the carpet on it, that's the problem that I more face, that I hear about. And a lot of the conversations from my end is more, yeah, let's take a different perspective on this. And I will push back on that one. But yeah, it gets pretty interesting. And I do a lot of those type of conversations.
I'm glad you have those because, as I think a lot of men, especially heterosexual men, have trouble discussing things like rape and sexual assault. But the truth is, we know men are victims. Oftentimes in college, they are victims and they're in hazing incidents. And sometimes there's a sexual component. And that's very demasculating. And I have seen so many men say, you know, they second guess themselves, they second guess, or what are others going to think of me? What's going to be the pushback from society? Well, we have a problem in our society if someone is afraid to admit that they were a victim of violence because they're afraid of what someone will say about them as a victim. No one criticizes a victim of a home burglary and says, "Oh, did you not have the proper locks on your doors?" Or, you know, I'm sorry, were you drinking that night? Did you forget to lock your doors? It doesn't matter. And this is probably the part that bothers me the most, is to hear, especially women, I hear say this: I should have come forward because I should have protected the other women that this person assaulted or abused. It is not a victim's responsibility to protect others, but they're made to feel that it was on them. And let's face the facts, rapists and abusers, they only have themselves to blame.
Yes. Yes. That's completely,
It's
absolutely the message. And, you know, it goes back to, it's like, look, that's who needs to stop. It's the rapists. They need to stop. Not, I love your analogy about the burglary. You know, you don't ever say to somebody, well, did you dress your house in a way that caused a burglar to want to just steal everything? No.
Hey, your house is pretty nice. I don't know if I'd live in a house that nice.
I don't know if I would drive that car.
Right. We don't say that. We don't say that to victims of other kinds of crimes. You know, the other part that bothers me is that there are victims of sexual assault and domestic violence that are children. And we forget that the long-term effects of this kinds of abuse, I mean, there can be health problems such as if you are a victim of childhood domestic violence, you have long-term effects such as obesity, chances are higher, your anxiety, your depression, your heart rate, your heart is affected. And this is probably brought on by stress and anxiety in childhood that changes your body in the formative years. These are things that we don't consider when we talk about child abuse. I would like to think that we have a handle on things. I will tell you that the numbers of reported domestic violence have decreased since the 90s, but have they really, or just have our reports gone down?
Yeah, Regina and I were talking about that just before this, about what's really going on as far as the trends. I know we're going to talk about that. We were going to ask you about that, but
yes,
there's this idea is, are the numbers truly going down or going up, or were they just always there and we're noticing them now? You know,
I believe they've been pretty much plateaued. I don't think there's any significant change. I think that people are going underground more. They're convincing their victims don't talk about it and shaming them more so that they hide it. But let's face it, there are populations where there are cultural issues that prevent someone from being public about the fact that they're domestic violence survivors. And it can cross any kind of socioeconomic background. Although I will tell you that people that are in lower socioeconomic homes face domestic violence at a higher rate, but they also have fewer resources. And there's other things that keep people from reporting. It could be language barriers or threats of, I'm going to have you deported if they're here, if they're immigrants. There could be also things such as classism. So many times people don't think that higher socioeconomic people can be victims of domestic or sexual violence, but that's not true at all. But there also could be issues of racism. And so if we've got a victim who is afraid of the police or distrusts the police, why would they call the police? And I would also like to point out that women, especially Black women, are more criminalized when they report sexual violence or domestic violence than any other race. They're criminalized. They're also the most likely to be injured when they try to fight back against their abuser and then get help. They're the ones that are more often jailed than any other race of women. Wow. I would really like to point out, because I think this part startles me so much, are the statistics that tell us when we break it down by race, we know that Black women suffer domestic violence and sexual assault at a much higher rate than almost any other category except for Native Americans. Native American women are probably the most preyed upon population, and they're considered the most disposable. And I don't believe it's changed, but there was no federal registry that was tracking how many Native American women have disappeared from reservations in the West. Now, that's startling to me, because it's a almost becoming a pandemic. And I wouldn't even say that almost, I would say it is becoming a real problem. The number of women who go missing or report domestic violence and sexual assault on reservations. The numbers are staggering, and there is very little protection for these women.
I did not know that.
Yes.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Wow.
It's disturbing. It really is.
And that makes, my mind has been racing for a few minutes about a couple of different things. What you just said, I immediately go to the uptake in human trafficking, right? And how much that has the spotlight on that every day. I feel like there's something every day. And honestly, I mean, I know we've had this conversation in my house. Some of the human trafficking stuff is coming from affluent communities.
Mm-hmm.
And that's scary. So even though statistically it's saying that it's this fraction of people, what we are seeing is only because there's some power and privilege, right? In why we're seeing it. So if that's what we're seeing at that level, what are we not seeing?
Right.
Those are always my questions. If we're seeing this, what are we not seeing?
What's hidden? You're
What's
only
hidden?
the tip of the
Right.
iceberg.
Right, absolutely. The other thing that I think about, Cindy and I put together a women's racial trauma healing group for the semester. And one of the things that came out of that group, and I think it's very, very reflective, not saying that any of those women were involved in any of these scenarios, but just talking in general and sharing about, familial trauma and how generational trauma impacts all of us, whether you are a woman of color or you are a white woman or however you identify, even as a man, and so when we think about that, we put that in the context of domestic abuse, right? That's generational trauma. And often, and I assume that you probably see this in your role, whether it was here or where you are at WIU, but if somebody's in an abusive relationship, they've seen it. They maybe have lived it, and it's normal, and it was normalized, and it wasn't talked about, whether that was culturally it wasn't talked about, or all of the other factors as to why it was talked about. So when we don't talk about those things, then suddenly we're living the life that we didn't want to live, or a person, not we, that a person is living the life that they didn't want to live, because that cycle just is repetitive. And, and when we think of domestic violence, I think we always think physical, right? But something that I have realized coming back into ed these last 5 years and talking into an array of students is there's psychological, emotional trauma that goes untalked about. When some students have shared how family members and you're just like, wow, that's how you were talked to. And they have, I think with the right guidance and the right conversations, and John and I were talking about this earlier, the process of cognitive development, social emotional development, that starts to unpack for them, and some realize that that's what was going on. But others, it takes a long time, if ever, that they come to a space that they realize that abuse doesn't mean somebody actually has to put their hands on you. No. Abuse can be in a way of words. I mean, it's that adage when we were growing up, right? Sticks and stones may break your bones, but where words will never hurt you, or whatever it was. But in reality, I think sometimes those words can be more impactful.
Studies have shown us that children who have witnessed a parent being abused can sometimes be as traumatic or more traumatic than their own physical abuse that you were mentioning. And also remember that abuse isn't just in one form. So most children who are victims are experiencing emotional trauma, maybe financial trauma, because they're not eating, they have insecurities, they may not have clothing, there may be sex abuse, but there's also physical abuse. All of these things can just snowball, and before you know it, you have a child who is anxious and depressed. And I know from working in higher ed, that my students today are facing things. I'm not saying that they're facing things that we didn't face when we were college students. We all face those things. But what's happening is, I think the fact that we're actually talking about it, it's almost like it gets worse before it gets better. And I know from my own experience working through that childhood trauma, sometimes can be really painful. And it's really hard, and affects every other aspect of your life. One thing I'm incredibly proud of, and I'm not going to say it's just something I did, but I broke that cycle in my own family. And that's something that's really important to me, because I didn't want my own children to be able to feel the kinds of things that I did. But as to your point, Regina, I was probably in my 30s before I could define exactly what had happened to me. I didn't know. We never talked about it. No one ever talked about it.
You didn't have a book, or I didn't have a book,
No.
or others didn't have a book called, My Grandmother's Hands, and,
Right.
The different levels of things that have come, the different books that have come out in the last 10 years, the last 5 years, the last 2 years, that specifically talk about that generational repetition and how detrimental. And I think that's the social, the sociology, anthropology combination to, the psychological aspect that we have to unpack and look at, that they're all in tandem together. I remember taking a class with Ira that I reflect back, just having this conversation, and we talked about race, power, and privilege. And those and gender, was in there. So when you think of that, how that impacts, what you say, what you do, those outside influences, how you interact with others, there is a social dynamic to that. And for some, the perfect storm happens in scenarios of social emotional abuse or physical abuse.
And speaking of perfect storms and intersectionality, we'd all be remiss if we didn't recognize is this past year in a pandemic, when everyone was isolated, how in the world must that have affected people who are in some pretty terrible relationships when they had to isolate?
And numbers to crisis centers were going up. I will tell you that, John. You're right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just, yeah. I mean, I imagine so when a person who's in a terrible relationship has nowhere else to go and can't interact with anyone. My God, this past year, what are we going to hear about 10 years down the line when people are able to deal with what they've had to deal with this year?
And couple that with the fact that budgeting has been cut, and so many of those crisis hotlines have fewer services than they had before. Mm-hmm. So especially in Illinois, I can speak to our own situation. Our victim advocates, which your university and mine share the same victim advocates, and their budgeting, their funding has been cut dramatically. We've lobbied the state of Illinois for more help, but it's like, the proverbial squeezing blood out of a turnip. There's only so much to go around. Yeah. So, I always look to how to find solutions. And you mentioned that earlier before we came on. What's the future look like for this kind of a landscape? And I wish I could say that I had a solution, because if I did, I would snap my fingers and it would be happening. But it really starts with education. And truly, I believe that education needs to start very, very young. And I'm talking kindergarten, because that's usually when we can get the first segue into a child, teaching them what proper communication looks like. When a child is a childhood victim, they don't know what healthy communication is. They may have only seen parents scream at each other, or maybe only have one parent, or maybe they're raised by grandparents, or maybe they're in foster homes. So they don't know what maybe a unit or a stable family might look like. So this is when we really need to start teaching them body autonomy, so that they know, you don't have a right to touch me without my consent. And it's very simple. And I mean, I know this sounds so trite, and we kind of laugh about parents who say, I'm not going to make my daughter or son or my child kiss Aunt Rudy or Ruby at the family gathering. But we shouldn't. Why would I do that? Why do I make my kids sit on Santa's lap? Those are not consensual things.
Yeah. I've always thought the same thing. I'm like, I don't know who this guy is.
And to a child, can you imagine how fearful they must be when they see this strange man with this huge beard, and mom wants me to sit on his lap and tell him what I want for Christmas. I mean, come on. The way we're viewing our children is if they belong to us, and they don't have a right to say no. The truth is, our children owe us nothing. Our children don't owe us a certain grade in class or how to behave. Our children, we owe our children things. And I grew up in a society where it was man up, or a no was just a challenge, especially to little boys. I don't think my generation did a great job raising our kids. And I'm going to be honest with you. I really don't. I'm hoping this generation that we're working with now does a better job and doesn't tell their young men that to man up and to walk it off. And women will entice you and then say no because they're teases. No, that's not true. But those are the kinds of messages that our young boys get.
Not all young boys.
Not all. I'm sorry.
I have 2 young boys in the house, and they will cry, and now, I mean, when we're talking about competing athletically, okay, if it's broken, like that's a whole different conversation. But as far as how we treat people, I would rather one of my kiddos be so angry that I'm that way. I'm that person. John and I, and Stephanie, you and I have joked about this before. I'm certainly if I'm crying, it's because there is some travesty that really has me upset. But often my tears are usually tears because I'm so angry, I don't want to choke you. And so my boys are both of my boys are that way. Their release is not to, yes, we encourage them to get it out in activities that, allow that stressor, just like for us as adults. But I'd rather you be upset and you cry because it's something really hurt you emotionally than you lash out in anger and you put your hands on someone. And the same for my daughter, that's the same thing. So I think, and I'm not perfect. We're not raising our children perfectly, but I think that there are, right, John and Stephanie, and we're not that terribly much difference in age. I do think that there is some learning that some of us have had in it, like you said, Stephanie, how we were raised has had an effect on how we want our children to respond to things, how we want them to respond to things, especially in situations like this. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. I agree with that. I'm always troubled by, I think we would be remiss if we didn't bring this all together and say, we've got a problem in our society. We've got a problem, and it's not a women's problem. It's not an LGBTQ problem. It is a human problem. Mm-hmm. That there are people that still continue to want to control other people, because let's face it, again, domestic violence and abuse and rape are all about control. They're not about necessarily sex, or they're not about love. They are about control. And why is there this pushback? It's because rights are being given to more people. They really are. And so the people that were holding control before are getting scared because they're losing it. And so I would like to say that this is, I kind of like to think of this as maybe it's the light before the beginning of dawn, maybe a beginning of good things. I'm not going to say that continuing to see abuse is something that's good. I don't mean that. But the fact that we're having these conversations, the fact that people are coming out and saying, hey, listen, this happened to me too. It makes us all realize we're not alone as victims. And second of all, it makes us realize that we really can come together to solve this problem. No matter what you think about Dr. Phil, I mean, I have some good and bad thoughts about him, but he did have the he started this movement where it was end the silence on domestic violence. And I really do believe that is what we need to do. Stop talking about it, or start talking about it, normalize these conversations, but normalize also talking about sex, because that's another issue that we have in our society. We don't talk about sex. We talk about it only as like it's dirty or it's bad. But you know what? Sex isn't. And the minute we can teach our children that sex is beautiful, is wonderful, and here's how to do it safely, I think we're on a better track. Have you all noticed, like, I'm just curious, in school, what kind of sex ed did you have?
Oh, gosh. I don't know. You
Yeah.
know, I
Terrible.
mean, I feel like I'm old. So were you asking that question? I'm like, where? I don't know that I mean, was it in junior high or in high school? I mean, I remember in junior high having the girl meeting,
They
right?
separated you guys? I did it
What?
all together. It was the guys and I was all together and nobody talked. Nobody talked.
Wait a minute. They brought the guys and the girls together in junior high to talk about, you know,
Nobody
girl
said anything.
periods and all that stuff. Like it was only us girls. And our mothers could be there.
The guys heard about periods just as much as women did. I mean, in that sense, it's kind of a cool thing.
That's
to,
good.
like,
You know?
That's good. Although it's embarrassing when you're 10 years old.
Yeah, everybody was giggling and,
Right.
you know,
Sure.
whatever. But then no questions. Does anybody have any questions? And just crickets, nothing. And the moment that class was over, in the hallways, everybody was, you know.
Can you believe what I said?
I said testicles. Oh my God, I can't believe it.
Vaginas.
And there is so little done to educate students. And I remember years ago, I was a substitute teacher, and I lived in this one district where the health teacher, she hated teaching that unit. So she would purposely take that week off 3 years in a row and had me come in and teach that class for her. I didn't mind at all because you know me, I'm not embarrassed to talk about anything. But I thought about, here's this middle-aged woman who was terrified to talk to a bunch of junior high or even, you know, younger children about sex. But we need to normalize these conversations and not make it taboo. You know, we talk about consent, but we don't ever tell children how to get, and I'm not talking sexual consent in children, but consent, how to get consent, period. Because that relates to everything else later on.
Yeah, about anything. Forget just sex, just about, you know, holding hands, kissing, whatever, like something, because it does build on other things.
It really does. And so I think those are the conversations that we need to work on. You know, as now a grandma of small children, I think about, I don't want those children raised to be afraid to talk about sex or to ask me questions. I laughed about this. My children are very open. Well, some of them are. Some of them have overshared, but I'd rather have them overshare than not tell me. And I was always glad when they would come to me with their questions. I might have cringed a little bit because I could talk to the two of you, but when it becomes your own child, it's a little bit different. But at the same time, I would rather the answers come from me than someone who doesn't love them. And those are the things, the conversations I think we're missing. And so you've got people that are still very puritanical in our society that believe we can't talk about sex, that have, you know, raising their children on the Bible. And I'm not criticizing that, but at the same time, you know, saved for marriage. Well, when we preach that, or when we talk about that, we're overlooking the fact that telling a child to wait for marriage isn't going to stop them from having sex. The numbers have proven that. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about being safe. Let's talk about being healthy. Let's talk about protection. Let's talk about emotional needs and what happens after you have sex, because we're not having those discussions with children either.
No, absolutely. I was lucky that I had some parents. My dad's a teacher, was an educator, and he takes a very conservative approach, by the way, but he at least was willing to have that conversation, that sit down conversation with my brother and I, and discussed with us, like, you know, what does it mean, you know, to have sex and whatnot. And I got to tell you that was helpful to me in middle school, you know, just to talk about things. And you might think middle school, oh my God, you know, hey, look at teen pregnancies.
Yes.
That's where it's, if you're not having those by that time, man.
Because I guarantee your kids have thought about it, whether you're talking about it or not.
And then they learn it from, you know, where they learn it from, right? You know, Stephanie, they're learning it from pornography. They're learning it from all these other places that do not teach consent, that do things that would harm people, you know, and they end up in your office, in mine.
They do. And that's sad to me because, again, pornography serves a purpose, I suppose. I mean, I've had conversations, even with your chaplain, Terry Ott, I've had these conversations. There are many kinds of pornography, and pornography can serve a purpose in some in some ways. I think pornography can be healthy when it's made. I think there needs to be more women involved in the making of it, and making it for women and not just men. I had this conversation with a friend who said that this was years ago, but a man at work said something very vulgar to her. And this was before there were Title IX offices and people turning this in. And she said, I think he must have seen some porn that told him women want to be talked to that way. No, they don't. I can tell you that right now. And I'm also going to point out that let's teach our boys not to send nude pictures. That's just right up there. Another one. Stick with me for more tips, but that's your tip for today.
Well, and not just, I'm gonna say not just boys. I have a soon to be 16-year-old, and he has told me things that was I'm told that he'd kill me, but we were, when we were all in quarantine last year and couldn't go anywhere, we had a fire in the fire pit, and mom and dad, and he came out and was talking to us, and some of the things he shared about what's going on. I firmly believe that Snapchat is the Antichrist. I mean, if you are going to send a message that can go away like that, right? And then the screenshots that can happen but it
doesn't go away.
But it doesn't go away. And I said that, and it was really a long time before we allowed him to, to have it. And we have a rising teenager that doesn't have it. And, I'm like, I have 20 somethings that come in my office and can't use Snapchat, and are sending pictures, nudies and things like that. And they're not using it right. What makes you think I'm going to let some 15-year-old, 14-year-old use, and I had a parent teacher conference not long ago, and one of the kids' teachers made the comment. She's like, oh, I gave you a shout out in class because the kids were all talking about Snapchat. And this was when CJ was in junior high, and CJ's like, yeah, my parents won't let me have Snapchat. And the teacher said in front of the class, that's because your parents are smart.
I definitely think social media has made things worse for teenagers.
Absolutely. That temptation to snap that picture and send it, and then you just, oh my goodness.
Yeah. I think it just solidifies why we need to have conversations with our children younger and younger, because if we're not,
somebody else is, right? Somebody else is. And I'm, as the person who helps spearhead, some of the equity efforts on campus, when people ask me what's too young to talk about race, right?
It's never too
young. It's never too young to, to have the conversation about sex. It is important to show our kids and our families and people around us what healthy relationships look like, and
that we deserve respect ourselves. Mm-hmm. And as role models, even like as parents, to demonstrate, I'm not going to let someone treat me that way. Or, maybe even being honest that, sex is healthy for adults. You have questions, let's talk about it. Those are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. And I truly believe it. But when I think about other people in the community and Monmouth, because I'm still part of the Monmouth community, we have a lot of our residents that, one, don't speak English, mm-hmm. and two, are very distrustful of law enforcement. And there need to be more resources for these populations. There need to be social services and outlets for them to ask questions when they feel, like John said, during a pandemic and they're trapped at home with their abuser. Mm-hmm. What are they supposed to do? We need to destigmatize coming forward if you're a victim of abuse or assault. And that's how to do it. I'm not sure, but I still think these conversations are the way to start.
Absolutely.
It's especially important because kind of transitioning a little bit, if you don't learn, and if you don't grow and develop and understand and respect other people, it, like Regina was alluding to, it may very much affect you growing up in your future career. We got a lot of politicians that are getting themselves in trouble for sending all kinds of pornographic pictures to other people and all these other kinds of, they should have learned. And looking forward to kind of life after college. I'm hoping that our students are learning that because it's an important lesson for them. They may think here in a college setting it's okay. It's not, but they may think it is. once you leave here,
it's really not okay. John and I talked about that this morning over coffee. Having spent 10 years of my adult professional career, outside of higher ed, there are, and not that I'm not saying that higher ed or ed makes an excuse or cover things up, but in a corporate business setting, harassment policies look significantly different. And so the things like John just described, those are not tolerable.
No, there aren't Title IX investigations. You're just fired.
You're fired. Or there's a reprimand. I remember spending almost a full day when I onboarded at Pfizer, having this conversation, what harassment looked like with different levels of HR from the company, and I remember having a conversation with someone because they had been reprimanded because they said something off the cuff and they were reported. Well, they had gotten away with saying it for their whole life and no one called them out and said, hey, that's not okay. And so they were hurt. They were like, I didn't mean it that way. I've said that 1,000 times. Well, I bet you have. But, when we don't hold people accountable for saying things, then they keep doing it. Stephanie, you and I have talked about this. It's like raising a small child. They keep touching. Well, at some point, whether it's 1 or 2 strikes, you have to up the ante because they have to know that it's not okay. And it's not because you want to do that. It hurts your soul to hold a little toddler accountable. But if we don't teach them then, when are we ever going to teach them? And then we have in corporate settings, in ed settings, people that say things and you're like, holy cow, I can't believe you just said that. Has no one ever told you before that that's not okay? And whether that's about race or ethnicity or sexual orientation, or, we could go through the list of those things. Absolutely. That's how we get to the point that we are where sexual assault, and we have to have an entire month to have a conversation and point it out that it exists.
And the big light through all of this is we're now seeing celebrities being held accountable,
absolutely,
which is not something we had before. And like one perfect example is Roseanne Barr, or whatever her last name she goes by now. She, she's a huge star. We know she's a name that everyone knows. She made a racist comment on Twitter. Her show was canceled within 9 hours. Yeah. So people are coming down hard on this behavior, as they should. And we're all seeing it trickling down. And I'm hoping that that's a good sign for all of us.
Yeah. And that to me is, I struggle, as things have unfolded this year for us. And I struggle with cancel culture. I do believe that in some situations, there are things that should be canceled, right? But I highly disagree that we cancel people just because we don't agree with them. That's where I draw the line. I am not going to cancel you because we don't believe the same thing, but you should be canceled if you're perpetuating rape culture. You should be canceled if you're perpetuating racism. Yes. You should be canceled if you are participating in, illegal sex trafficking or all of these things. You should be canceled. And maybe the better term for that is you should be held accountable. Right.
Absolutely.
So when we look at situations like Jeffrey Epstein and we look at all of the faces, my husband and I couldn't even make it through that documentary. We made it halfway through and we saw enough celebrities that have not been held accountable, including a past president, a recent president. You're just like, whoa, make everybody accountable. Right.
Yep. Sadly, Jeffrey Epstein was never even held accountable. He got the easy way out. I'm disturbed by that. But Harvey Weinstein is another one. And he plays the martyr card now that he's meek and sick. I don't care. You traumatized probably hundreds of women. We just don't know it.
Yeah.
And maybe men too. I don't know, but the majority of his victims have been women. Bill Cosby's another one, and that one was hard for me. That one and Matt Lauer,
absolutely.
we had these images of what they were. You know, Matt Lauer was the epitome of cool grace, and then Bill Cosby was everybody's dad. And,
Right.
and you have to reconcile that, okay, I had this image of you, but this is really who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just what they did, it's who they are.
Right. No, absolutely.
Not one isolated incident. And that's the difference, I think, with the cancel culture. You're right. If it's someone who's really made a mistake, I've made mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
John knows that. He had to call me out on a mistake I made once. And I'm so glad he did. And I'm glad I have that relationship with him that we could do that. Mistakes. People make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
People who don't learn from the mistakes are the problem.
Right. Yeah, we should invite people in for conversations. Repetitive behavior means that you're not willing to authentically make a change.
That's right.
And so I tell students all of the time, call people in first, give them a chance. And if they can't live within that space, then it's okay to cut them out, right?
Yes.
So, well, we are coming up. Oh my goodness, Stephanie, it's been so long since we've had one of these talks. We could talk for like another hour plus and add about 10 more things in there on that. So John and I are just so grateful for you and our continued, working relationship, though you are down the way. But more importantly, our friendship, we love you, and you bring so much to this, and your grace and your conversation, and the things that just please, I hope you know how much we appreciate you.
You have no idea how much I love you both. And thank you for having me today.
Yes.
Thanks for coming on.
Yes, absolutely. So we are going to sign off of Facebook. Thank you for joining us. Steph, if you'll hang on for just 1 minute once we sign off. But everybody, John and I are back next week, next Wednesday, same time, same place for our last campus conversation of the semester. And that's the big one.
Yeah,
Life after college. We dabbled a little today, but life after college. So join us for that conversation. And thank you, everybody. We'll talk to you soon.